Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Ogonek. I am the product manager at Nikon Canada, and I'm assuming that most people are actually here to talk to Brad Hill. Brad, I won't go and give your whole bio because I'm pretty sure everybody knows it, but photographer, photo tour expert, does training on the side, seminars, you name it, you do it. So, Brad, thanks very, very much for joining me tonight.
Oh, thank you. You're more than welcome, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
So, everybody, what we're going to be doing today is essentially we're here for you. Brad has had tons and tons of experience with the Z9, also with a bunch of the new Z lenses. So we're basically here to cater to you guys. Any questions that you have, that is our purpose, is to get them answered. We already have a bunch of them streaming in, and that is fantastic. Now, Brad, you've put aside, what, about 5-6 hours for tonight's live stream?
Well, actually, I was going to spend the first 5 minutes debating with you who's going to host. Yeah, 5 or 6 hours. We could easily get down there with the questions, I think. So, yeah.
So we have quite a few people already. We have 103 people already watching. So this is fantastic. So let's actually jump right on in. Brad, I'll say that we don't really have any plan for today in terms of a presentation. I'm not going to be showing anything. You're not going to be showing anything. We might show slides here and there, but it's basically just still images. It's not actual presentation. So this truly is about trying to answer people's questions, because there's so much information out there. These people who are kind of watching us, I'm sure, want very specific things answered. Now, just so that everybody knows, there are obviously a lot of questions already streaming in. We do have a couple people from Nikon Canada just in the chat. So we have Russ Vanderleer, who is our Western rep. If anybody's familiar with the camera store, anybody in that area, that is the rep, Russ. So he will be jumping on. If you see somebody without the Nikon logo speaking with high authority, that is because he is a Nikon employee. And we also have Nathan Wilkinson, who's one of our central reps, who will be answering questions as well if anything pops up that Brad and I can't get to. So, Brad, why don't we kind of jump on in? Let's kind of start with John Williams. He started it off at the very top. So let's kind of start going through a few of his questions, because he has 4 or 5 of them already here. So let's kind of start off with his first one. What do you recommend, VR on or off, when shooting at faster shutter speeds? Basically anything 1/2000 of a second or faster.
Yeah, this is one that comes up time and time again. And all I can really say on this one is that this is one I've tested extensively under controlled conditions, shooting handheld and tripod mounted, both, with a variety of lenses, normally using, if the lens supports it, a VR sport mode, and shooting at a whole range of shutter speeds. And I've been yet to determine any negative effect at high shutter speeds on image quality whatsoever. So some argue that it may affect the background and the bokeh. I haven't been able to find it myself. Now, that said, Chris, of course, if you're at ultra low shutter speeds on a tripod, you can have effects associated with drift of the image, etc. So that's when at ultra low shutter speeds, and I'm talking a second, half a second, and you're on a firm tripod, cable release, etc., you want to turn the VR off in those scenarios with all cameras or lenses both.
I will agree with that. I will say that I've done some testing with tripod use, and the new Z bodies with the Ibis system, it actually works really well. I would recommend, if you have a very stable platform, to turn it off, just to give you. But I had a bunch of our sales guys basically run a whole bunch of tests internally, and one of the things I had them do was, I want you guys to go and do a sequence of slow shutter speeds with Ibis or with your VR on while on a tripod, and it was actually quite remarkable how good the new VR system is at actually turning on, or kind of noticing that it's on a tripod and not amplifying that any movement. But I will agree with you that a lot of the times I have heard people ask, do you have an effect, a negative effect, by using VR? I've heard this time and time again, but I have not seen it. And internally, I have not been able to get a yes saying, "Oh yeah, no, this is something we should turn off." I've never seen it one way or the other. So it's not to say,
Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
it's not to say that it doesn't exist. Maybe in some instances that some people have been able to recreate, but both you and I have not been able to see it.
Yeah, and the final comment I'll make on this one, or we'll be on this issue all night, is that the other scenario you run into in the heat of the action is again, a setting that you don't want to have to turn it on and off, and remember you've turned it on and off. If it's working and you're getting good results, just keep it on, and don't ask for trouble.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, I will say I usually recommend people to go and use a Sport VR, just like you were talking about earlier. I was really recommending Sport VR for any type of movement, any type of panning, especially when you're dealing with moving fast, erratic subjects. You want VR on. Okay, so let's jump on to question 2. If shooting RAW, does it matter which picture control setting one uses? If so, what do you use for birds or other wildlife? So I'll kind of start off with this by saying it does matter depending on your photo editor, because with, let's say, something like Lightroom, with Lightroom, the settings you have in the camera, your picture control, whether you have active de-lighting turned on or off, all those settings will actually get ported over. So one good thing is that if you want your end result to look similar to what you're actually seeing through the camera, then I would say, yes, it does absolutely make a difference. Now, that you do have to turn that setting on with Lightroom, and you can turn it off so that it's basically zeroed out. But it's one of those choices you have to make. I personally like to know what I want my image to look like on Lightroom. Therefore, I know what I want it to be with at capture. So I will set it to usually portrait profile, because I like that there's a little bit more saturation. I'll maybe sometimes bump it up 1 bar, and I'll usually increase the sharpness a touch, because portrait usually dials that down a little bit. But I find portrait is very similar to neutral, where it helps bring up some of the shadows. So you kind of get that best of both worlds without being too flat, like you sometimes get with a pure neutral or the flat option. So that's kind of my take on it. Brad, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, there's the other side of the coin on this one is the impact it has on a Z9 looking through the viewfinder. Is you pick a different picture control, and it will impact the view through the viewfinder. So what I've been doing, and I experimented with the whole array of them that are in the picture controls, is I ended up settling on, to mimic the scene most accurately, I ended up settling on the standard picture control. And with that, I did go in and bump the contrast down slightly. So I went into the control settings and bump them down a little bit to, again, bring up those shadows a little bit. And I find that it ultimately, with that situation, I get the most realistic view. The other thing I did do in my particular case is I have tweaked the again, for the EVF, I've tweaked the color balance slightly in mine, and I can show that if anyone wants to see it. I can just bring the camera up and show people what I've done to it. But I've gone slightly warmer on mine. Again, just
and you do shoot. You do edit in Capture One. So with your Capture One, that is going to affect, basically you're making your changes based on how you want to view the image. I'm making changes to my picture control based on what I want my final image to be. So there's a different way of kind of doing it depending on your photo editor, depending on how you want to shoot. So there's many different ways to do it.
Right. So it's a case of are you doing it for at time of capture or for post-processing? And my adjustments I was referring to are for time of capture.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to number.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Let's go to number 3. How does the camera's Ibis work on adapted glass? So something like an F mount, a 500 mil, let's say the PF, versus true Z glass. They've read that the number of axes of stabilization differ, and the answer is yes, absolutely. You're getting 5 axes of stabilization with any true native NIKKOR Z lens, but with the any F mount lens that you go and put on a Z body, you're only going to get 3 axes of stabilization. So you are going to get a slight bump. We don't actually say what that figure is in terms of the amount of stabilization and stops. Brad, I think you've actually kind of done a little bit more testing, and since I can't officially give a number, did you have one on the back of your head?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yes. And what I did was testing, in a sense, not so much pure VR performance, but what I would call hand holdability, literally seeing how much slower I can hand hold a shot at when I'm using a Z mount camera with the Ibis versus the F mount. So the identical lens. So say, for instance, the 500 PF. And what I was finding overall is that the Z cameras I'm getting compared to a DSLR, and these are lenses, of course, that have lens-based image stabilization. I'm still getting about an extra half stop on average in terms of the shutter speed I can go in terms of how low and get a sharp shot. So there's a slight bump, both in VR Sport or VR Normal. The bump is parallel in both of them.
Okay, and then 4 to 5 questions for John. For auto ISO, what do you use for your max? Now, I'm pretty sure this is going to be every single person is going to have a different answer to that. And it even depends on the situation that you're shooting in. Like in the actual menu, you can choose whether you want different auto ISO for when you're using flash or just ambient light. So there's a lot of different ways. Did you have a particular ISO that you're finding you're happy with the Z9?
Yeah, if I'm shooting, what I do is I have different auto ISO settings set up in my different shooting banks. So shooting bank A, which I consider for general shooting, I use that one for day-to-day sort of shooting. And what I'm finding with that is I like to cap it at about ISO 6400 with the Z9. A couple of my other shooting banks are set up for shooting action. And for those, I'm willing to have it drift higher, and I'll have it drift up to ISO 8000 myself. And so that's what I've been doing, and so far been very happy with the results. This whole game of how high are you willing to let your camera drift up if you're an auto ISO, or to manually select it, this is an ever-changing field, not only in terms of the cameras moving forward, but we're getting better and better noise software all the time. And so we're finding, and Chris, you know this, I was a bit concerned about the ISO performance of the Z9 before I had one in my hands. And since shooting it, I discovered, not only if I downsample the images to the size of, for instance, a D6, I'm only losing about a third of a stop in ISO performance. But also with the new noise reduction software, I'm not feeling limited in ISO in any way with this camera compared to a D6. I can go and basically treat it the same way. And you've always got to remember that you're shooting higher resolution files, and it's unfair to compare, completely full resolution files. Just downsample a Z9 file, or a for that matter, Z7 II file down to D6 size to make a true comparison. So,
yeah, totally agree. I see a lot of online forum debates where people show one way or the other that you can get it down to a D6 level, you cannot get it down to a D6 level. There's a lot of kind of back and forth. In my experience, in almost all instances, I'm able to get it to the point where I'm as happy as with a D6. So for me, I have no problem going up to at least 8,000 to 10,000 ISO, depending on the situation. And if I need to push it, well, then I'll push it just a little bit more, knowing I'll need to do a little bit more legwork on the back end. All right, so last question by John. Well, last question that he's put in so far that I can see. Number 5, in terms of photo quality, have you seen any difference between RAW and high efficiency star? Now, for anybody who's not aware, with previous cameras, we've had the ability to change between 14-bit and 12-bit. And then within each of those options, you could go lossless compressed, or uncompressed file type. So there's a lot of different ways to go in and manage it. But now when you actually go into it, and I'll actually show my camera here, when you actually go into the raw image or raw recording option of the camera, when you go here, you only have 3 options: lossless compressed, high efficiency star, and high efficiency. Now, all of these are 14-bit. And that's the amazing thing, is you're not having to take a hit to go down to 12-bit, which, to be honest, taking a hit to 12-bit is something I don't really think is that big of a deal anyways, but that's a different discussion for a different day. The big question, though, is what's the difference between lossless compressed and high efficiency? In my opinion, what I was told by Japan before the launch, which then I obviously tested, and Brad, I know you've tested as well, the difference between lossless compressed and high efficiency star is literally nothing. I cannot tell a difference in a number of different situations that I've tested against, and I cannot tell. I have heard, so Japan did say that the difference between, let's say, lossless compressed and high efficiency, if you are really looking, I'm talking like 200% zooming in, and you're in a really, really difficult lighting situation with a ton of contrast, then you might be able to see a difference. So I would say the way I have my camera set up, and I actually just emailed an MPS member earlier tonight answering this. I have my camera set up to high efficiency star. After all the testing I've done, after all the results I've seen online, that's how I have my camera set up, because I can't see a difference, and therefore, if I can't, I will take that half a file size difference that the high efficiency star gives me. The one thing I will say, and I think, Brad, you're running into this now, is it depends on your actual editor as to if you can actually properly edit the high efficiency star right now. Brad, am I right in saying that Capture One cannot currently, that they will be obviously doing it as soon as they can, they cannot do high efficiency star?
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. At this point, they're supporting lossless compressed only, but I'm anticipating very soon we'll see support for the other two RAW formats. And I just want to say that I've gone into room and I've done my testing in high contrast scenes, low contrast scenes, out of focus zones, abrupted transition from in focus to out of focus and high contrast, looking for compression artifacts. And I can see no difference between, at least in the testing I've done so far, no difference again between lossless compressed and high efficiency star. And I have to say that the difference even with high efficiency is at the pixel peeping level only. It's really hard to even see a difference between lossless compressed and high efficiency, which is smaller again. And I think that's a good point to make, is that, of course, the big advantage of these formats is that you're dealing with about, you're only 63% or so of the size on a high efficiency star. And I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but it's even smaller than that with high efficiency. I think it's closer to 50%.
Yeah, so it's 50% decrease going from lossless to high efficiency star, and then
Right.
you're at about 70%, 65-70% to go down to high efficiency. So you're
Right.
really gaining a lot of file size. It basically goes from like let's say a 70 meg file to a 35 meg file down to like a 20 meg file.
Yeah. So, but just people should be aware that what reason this can be important is not only in terms of saving card space, but also in terms of your burst depths. So if you're trying to shoot, hundreds and hundreds of image at the highest frame rate, if you've got a smaller file, you're going to have a larger burst depth in terms of how many you can shoot. And the other thing there that dramatically affects those burst depths is just throttling the camera down a bit. You can go with some cards from shooting 180 lossless compressed at 20 frames a second. If you throttle it down to 15 frames a second, you can fill the card. So it could be 5,000 shots at 15 frames a second.
Brad, don't give them more ideas. We don't get them down the route of asking about memory cards, because that's a totally different. We have enough questions for now.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking over, and I'm just kind of like, oh my God, it's going to be a 6-hour session.
No. So anybody, if you are curious, we can go into memory cards afterwards. Brad and I have, over the months, we've gone back and forth over this, so we can go into that. But I want to go and answer Marcia's question, and I'm actually going to throw this one over to you, Brad. It's please address the different banks and how to use them / back them up, because I use them a little bit, but I'm not as religious in kind of jumping around and setting them up. So I know that you use yours to great efficiency, is the way I think I'll put it.
Yeah, this is a big picture. This is a big discussion, and I'll only have to skim the surface right now. With the Z, we've had shooting banks on the high end or the higher end DSLRs, such as the D500, D850, of course the flagship level, the D5s, the D6, for years, and we didn't have them in the Z6 and the Z6. Z7, but they've come back in the Z9, and they've improved. One of the big changes, or the things they did, is they included in the photo shooting menu, they included your autofocus settings, so autofocus mode, AF area mode, as well as your subject detection options. They also included VR in there. And so it's made them infinitely more useful. And so you're in a scenario now where you can set those shooting banks up for very different uses of the camera. So as an example, your shooting bank A, as I mentioned earlier, may be set up for something like general shooting, and that you'd have your auto ISO set up for possibly lower shutter speeds. You could pick your autofocus mode, and then a second shooting bank set up for instance action, and where you may go to, for argument's sake, wide area autofocus with subject tracking on, a higher shutter speed built in, and so they can be, you can set your camera up now much more customized for different shooting modes, and because you can program buttons to move between these banks quickly, you can be, turned one way shooting a landscape, and then all of a sudden right behind you, you've got the, a Wolverine fighting with a cougar over a wolf carcass, and turn around and shoot that, and just flip a quick flip, and bang, you're shooting action. Now custom banks can also be set up. You've got 4 shooting banks, and you also have 4 custom banks, and the only reason I miss is there's some in the Z9 that was in the D5 and D6 that is found in the custom banks. It's called recall shooting functions, and because there's 4 different shooting banks, you can actually set up 4 different configurations of recall shooting functions. And why these are important is similar to what I was describing with shooting banks. You can have these set up where a button, your camera changes dramatically in what it's set up for. So you may go from manual exposure over to aperture priority, and the other one. You've got a whole list, and probably best if, Jacob, if I could go over to my camera, it's probably best to show what can be set up over in the camera. And so what I'll do is just go over, and as I said, with the we're dealing now with the custom banks. They're under the controls, and they're sort of hidden a little bit, but what you've got to do is go into your custom controls and pick a button. Now I happen to have mine set up on lens function buttons, so we'll go in there and you'll see the recall shooting functions. And so what this ends up meaning is that if you push a button, in this case it would be my lens function button, it would take me over, and no matter what shooting mode I'm in, it'll change it over to manual mode. It'll give me a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. In this case, I've dialed the aperture almost all the way down, and the result of that is, regardless of the lens I put on my camera, it's going to throw it wide open. So even if I've got a 50mm f1.2 on it, because I've inputted a value of 1.1, it's going to always, even with that lens, shoot it wide open. And so these are all the things you can set when you're in recall shooting functions by just pushing a button, and have all these settings change at once. And so you can have one set up for high-speed action, one for landscape. Again, just to, so it adds more customizability and quicker response going back and forth between your cameras. So it's really an excellent feature. And these, as I said, were stored in your custom menus. And because you've got 4 banks of them, you could set up 4 different configurations of recall shooting functions, and also have 4 configurations of shooting banks. So it does allow for a lot of customizability. At the same time, there's a lot there. So you really, and I spend a lot of time helping people set up their Z9. And if someone isn't familiar with shooting banks, that would be the first step. Get them familiar with that, and then think about changing your custom banks. It's a pretty big issue, or pretty big topic, to say the least, and I've just skimmed it at best. So I'll hand that one over to Chris. So
yeah, it's one of those that you could literally customize the camera any which way. And one thing I want people to understand is, just because I shoot one way or Brad shoots one way, it doesn't mean that it's always necessarily going to work for how you want to go and set it up. And I don't mean to say this to say that, Brad, the way you're doing it is wrong, but it's literally, you have to find out how your brain works, what makes sense to you when you're in the moment and you're actually shooting. How does your brain work? Brad spends hours and hours and days. I can tell you guys, because we go back and forth kind of trying to figure out the best way to do stuff sometimes. And when you spend that much time on this, it's amazing what he's able to kind of figure out and see what works. But I got to tell you, there's some stuff, the way he does it, I just go, ooh, no, that takes too much thought for me for some of the ways that he shoots, because I'm not in the situations that he's in. If I was always shooting, and if I was, let's say, to go on one of his photo tours, and I was immersed in that type of material, that type of subject matter all the time, then yes, I probably would switch to something like that. But if you're somebody who kind of jumps around to a lot of different subject types, doing portraiture, sports, action, wildlife, and you kind of do a little bit of everything, then you may not want to kind of turn your brain down that path. Or maybe you use those the banks to actually help you shoot those different subject matter. So there's a million and one ways to do it. We won't go through it too much, because like Brad said, we could literally take the entire time today just going over different ways to do it. Just try and find your own way is the way that I'd recommend.
The only thing I'd add to that, Chris, if I could, is that one of the worst things that can happen to a photographer, especially one getting a new camera, is I always call it getting lost in the camera. So when you're in a field setting, and this is what I think you were talking about, you're at the point where you almost feel like dropping the camera and saying, I give up, because it can be so complicated. And so it takes, and I have to admit that I'm using the Z9 since late November, and there's still things that are evolving in my setup, because I think of a new way to do it a little quicker or easier, but it becomes the last thing you want to do is get lost in your camera in a high stress situation where you've got a lot of action around you, be it a sporting event, being a wedding. You don't want to get lost in your camera, and so you keep it as simple as you can to handle what you're regularly shooting. But at the same time, for those that are behind their camera a lot, some of these features are really, really compelling. And so, I always tell people to, take it one bite at a time. It's just, there's a lot there.
Oh, there's so much. And like, this isn't to say that if you're coming from a smartphone to a Z9, obviously there's a really big learning curve. Even if you're coming from something like a D6, there's a significant learning curve. So take it nice and easy. It's great that you guys are here to kind of try and glean a little bit more information from people who have played with the camera, but continue with that. That's kind of the goal. Okay, so let's kind of jump on to another question. So Jeff, he has a long one where he basically talks about something that, Brad, you had a blog post recently where you talked about wide area AF, and you basically were showing that in the wide area options, if I'm kind of going off my brain and not reading the question, in the wide area options, because subject detection is used, if let's say you had a bird where the autofocus point was on its chest, well, you would expect, maybe just thinking about it, that you would only have the camera focus on the chest. But because you have subject detection turned on, one of the cool things that actually happens is, as long as your subject is taking up that box, the camera is smart enough to be able to realize or the fact that it's not just looking at the chest of a bird, that there's more to it, and that you probably, as the photographer, want, let's say, the eye in focus, and it will actually jump. Even though the box may be here, you'll actually have the autofocus eye box jump up and actually be detected and track the eye. So Jeff is saying, blah, 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 even if the wide area wasn't on the subject for a limited time. So he said that he's found that the setting for blocked shot response determined how long the system would track outside the area, 5 being the longest before it tried to refocus. And then he asks, have you found that in your testing?
I haven't noticed that specific that the block shot response, which is in custom setting A3, I believe, that it changes how long it will hold. Now, there's two different things going on here. And I'm going to take you over because I think some people may have missed a little bit what we were talking about with respect to how the wide area works. And so I've got a couple images here I can show and quickly go through that, because it's actually it's a very simple concept, but you almost have to see it in action to understand it. So Jacob, I'm going to head over to my desktop again here, if you could take me over. So what we've got here is, this is the real situation that I was shooting just over a week ago. And what we've got is, I was using, and this is the box you're seeing right here where my mouse is going over. This is the wide area small focus box. And I did have subject detection turned on. And a lot of people felt or thought that what would happen in this mode, so here's what I'm referring to here. In this mode, what would happen is that the subject detection box itself, that's looking for the eye or the head or the torso, would not move outside this area. Well, it will jump and persist outside here for an extended period of time. It doesn't go away, it sticks. And that's actually a great thing in my opinion, because you can just have, as long as you're on the subject, it will look, it's smart enough to use data from outside. Like, it obviously from that box alone couldn't say, aha, this is a bird. So it's obviously using data from the entire, and this is a full frame image by the way, the entire sensor, and saying, aha, that's a bird, I should look for an eye, even though it's outside the box, so it jumped up. Now, even if you're only partly overlapping like this, you're still going to find that it's smart enough to go, aha, there's a bird under at least part of this box, I'm going to jump up and grab its eye, or if its eye wasn't showing its head, etc. And last but not least, though, if you're outside the box, if the focus box is outside, you will not have a jump over to the subject. It's saying, no, there's no subject under the box, therefore I'm not going to look for an eye. So that's in terms of when you're doing the capture. Now, at the same time, one thing you can have, and I think this might be what Jeff is referring to, is if you're on this, and I can't show this on the slide, but if you're on the subject and you've got the box is, let's go back to this scenario, and the eye focus detect box has come on and is in the right spot, and then you slip off the subject below, it will temporarily show a eye focus detection box on that eye for a period of time. It's maybe a second. But it's just ephemeral. It goes away because it goes, okay, we're no longer on that subject. So that would be the scenario where you're then right off it like this and say, no, there's no eye under this. Now, I think Jeff might be referring to the fact that when you've moved the box off, the focus box off, the wide area focus box, that it is no longer, it's holding the eye a little bit longer when you take it off. I'm not sure that's what he's referring to, but if that's the case, I have not specifically tested that. As I'm sure you know, Chris, there's about 9 zillion use cases that you can come up with, and it's hard to test them all. We do our best to try to test out every scenario. I got an email just before we came on tonight about a gentleman who was photographing through volleyball nets and was having some struggles and trying to get eye detect to work through volleyball nets. And I believe he's true. It's true, but boy, there's a lot of use cases for us to examine. So.
Well, okay, so what I'll actually do is I'm going to combine Jeff's question along with Williams, which is a little bit further down. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to throw something into the chat, and hopefully it popped in as a link. Let's see if it actually does. What I'm linking to, there we go. Okay, so it did. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to open up that link. It is not a virus, I promise. It is going to the, you're going to go to page 17 just for easy use. And what I want to do is while you guys are looking there, I'm actually going to turn my camera on and show you the menu that I want to be going through. So when I am showing here in the custom setting menu, under focus, and as Brad said, it's focus tracking with lock on. So Jeff's question was specifically, does blocked shot AF response, whether you change it from quick all the way to delayed, will this have a difference when you're using subject detection? And if you go to page 17, one of the things that I have not got proper 100% clarification on is in that chart, if you go and look at wide area large or auto area or 3D tracking, under the blocked shot AF response, you just see a bar. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that bar to me, and this is me without, this is not coming from Nikon Corp. This is my understanding of what this chart is telling me. It tells me that option 1 through 5 doesn't actually matter. It's basically set as one option. Now, this is going against what I think some people are seeing out in the field, which I don't disagree that this is what they may be seeing in the field. But based on some of the information, I do not think that either the block shot AF response or the subject motion is actually it won't make a difference if you're using an autofocus mode that uses subject detection, that being auto area 3D, wide area large, or wide area small. And that ties into William's questions where he says, can you comment on what we know at this point about the interactions between the block shot response in A3 and subject detection? So the answer is, I don't have an exact answer. So maybe we come back in a couple of weeks and a couple of months and I'll have one. But based on what this chart is telling me, it seems to be that subject detection, when it's turned on, you do not have any movement in these menu options when you go and change them around.
Yeah, Chris, I'll just jump in, and one, we did get Jeff's question right. Guessing that he was talking about that situation at the end, the latency of the point holding onto the eye. I read those tables the same way you are, and the other thing that's sort of confounding the issue a little bit, and we've got to suss out further, is if you go to the reference manual on page 600, I believe it is, there's a reference to the fact that if you're using 3D tracking, not subject detection, but 3D tracking, that regardless of the setting you're on, it performs at level 3 for the block shot response. Okay. So yeah, that's in the reference. So it's suggesting, I think, that when we're doing some of these tracking and subject detection options, that we've got a totally different animal going on vis-a-vis the algorithms, and they could well just simply ignore those settings. And again, we've got to find that out because it's the question's being asked, and it's a good question. So absolutely, and I have asked the question to some of my tech people that I can try and get answers from in Japan. So I'm still waiting to hear back. And when I do, I will. I'll definitely let Brad know, and hopefully he can pass it on to his followers on his site. So let's now jump over to Rick. So Rick C, what actually triggers the eye detect feature? Is it simply the face recognition setting in B4, or is it the combination of that setting and subject selection? So it actually doesn't have anything to do with B4, and I'll actually jump back to my camera here and show you guys. So what Rick is talking about in B4 is here. So matrix metering face detection. So this is basically just how will the camera meter the scene when using matrix metering? Will it detect, if it detects a face, will it bias that detection, bias the exposure due to the face that it sees? So B4 actually has nothing to do with the actual subject detection. It's only to do with how the scene is metered. Now, if we go over to the
photo shooting menu, this is where, and I go here, AF subject detection option. So this is where the eye detect comes in, and it is whether you have it set to auto, which will do all 9 different subjects, or you can individualize it and have it be people only, animal only, vehicle only, or you can turn subject detection off. If you turn, so Rick, if you turn subject detection off, you will no longer have eye detect. That's the whole, this entire menu right here is what will affect whether you have eye detection on or not. And it's not just eye detection. One of the cool things is there's different levels to it. If you're really, really far away, it'll do body detection or it'll do head detection. And to be totally honest with most people, you actually will never see body or head detection unless they're turned away from you. The eye detect is so good that you'll pretty much always see an eye, but you will see with other animals. I've seen it with, let's say, deer, where they're a decent distance away and it won't actually pop onto the head or the eye. It'll go onto the body at first. So there are different kind of distance-based levels, but all of that, regardless of whether it's eye, head, or body, it's all based within this menu system, the AF subject detection options.
There's one thing I'd jump in and say there. I actually, surprise, I got around to testing the actual menu setting you're talking about vis-a-vis the bias towards a face on the matrix metering, and it works fantastic. So now it can result, if you're in a high contrast situation, in exposing the face right and blowing up the background, but that face gets a heavy bias and it works fantastic. And it is limited, if people ask, it is limited to human faces. So this is not a bear's face, this is not an owl's face, this is human face. And it does work extremely well in terms of an effective bias, in terms of getting the exposure right on that face.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where most of the time I want that feature on because you want your exposure bias, but there are some instances where if you're shooting, let's say, a lot of weddings, events, where you may want to just be full manual, you don't want to kind of be biased, you're going to be using flashes, so you don't want to care about that, or maybe let's say you're okay bringing up the shadows afterwards and you want that really saturated blue sky. But just be aware that that menu option exists and you're able to tweak it to how you want. Now, Bill is asking, if shooting on a tripod, how do you minimize vibration after tripping the shutter, since the electronic shutter, since the exposure delay mode was removed from this camera? And to be honest, it is a very, very simple fix. And all it is you're going to go to the top of the camera up here. You're going to switch it all the way to the multi-continuous burst option. And then once you're there, what you would then go and do is, and I'll switch over to my camera so you guys can actually see it. So on the top of the camera, you'll see that same continuous burst option. So that is what I'm going to press. So now when I go onto the camera and I press this down, you can go and switch between single, low, high, and you can see that I'm changing all of these options here by using the rear command dial. If I want to quickly change between 15, 12, or 10 frames a second, I can go and do that with the front command dial. So I can go and do the same thing with low. I can go anywhere from 1 all the way up to 10. So this is a really, really quick and easy way. I usually keep it on this setting just because it's so fast to jump through. I can go and get into C30 mode, C120 mode, but for Bill, what I would recommend, go to the self-timer. Go to the self-timer and you can set it anywhere between 10, 20, 5, or 2 seconds, and just leave it at 2 seconds. And now, every single time you go and press that shutter, it's going to wait 2 seconds. So yes, you don't have the exact capability of being able to do a 0.5 second with like the exposure delay, but you still have the ability to do that. And any time you let's say turn the camera on and off and on and off, that 2 second delay always stays there. So you don't have to worry about it resetting every time you turn the camera off. Okay, so Brad, I'm going to throw this next one over to you. Cool Wildlife asks, for birds in flight, what's the best way to focus in heavy snow? He's been using wide area large on a hawk owl in heavy snow, and he got a very, very precise 64.222644 focus rate. Is there a better autofocus mode to be using? Manual? Is there anything else that you would kind of recommend?
Yeah, that's tough when there's heavy snow. There's my default whenever you're in, and I've got to test this more fully, but I'm making some assumptions here where I've always found in low contrast situations, and I know that's not exactly what we're talking about, but it tends that way with snow coming down in front. There's that reducing the contrast on your subject somewhat. I've always found historically with the DSLRs that I did better with group area in very low contrast situations. And I haven't fully tested this yet, so I don't want to say it's true, it's for sure, but I suspect going to one of the wide area modes, and I'd likely pick wide area small likely, but again, it depends on how quickly that subject's moving, is likely going to do a better job than most of the others. Failing that, I think you're going back to what Chris is suggesting is manual mode. And something I want to point out is that manual override on this on the Z9 is exceptionally easy to do and to control if you've got focus peaking on, which is the route I recommend people take. And there is something to point out here, is that if you're using a Z mount lens, you don't have to make any lens adjustments, but if you want to override by simply touching the lens's focus ring, if you're using an F-mount super telephoto that has the traditional A/M, M/A, which means auto over manual, manual overrides auto, etc., you've got to pick the M/A setting for that to override any one of your AF modes by simply turning the control ring slightly. So make sure you're on, and I could grab, here's a 500 PF. What I'm referring to here, and I hope I can hold it well enough in front of this switch right here, this one here. So you want to be in MA mode. Doing this backwards behind the camera, MA mode rather than AM, if you want to be able to override simply by touching your focus without doing it, your focus ring without doing anything else. And like I say, it's really easy to control if you've got focus peaking on. I've been doing that rather than switching from 3D tracking to, as an example, 3D tracking to single point. I'm simply overriding with touching that, and it's working fantastically well. So that's the route I like to go. So again, I try wide area first to see if you can cut through and you've got enough contrast on the subject with the snow coming down. If that doesn't fail, I would override, manual override. And sometimes we're just in situations that confuse any camera. So.
All right, thanks, Brett. So let's jump over to the next question. So Brett is saying that he's having, actually, sorry, before I get to Brett, I'm actually going to say that there was a follow-up by Cool Wildlife who says for birds in flight that he's been shooting, they've been shooting 120 frames per second to get more choices of the wing positions. But he's asking, are the additional wing positions worth the sacrifice in image quality? And I'm going to give a very simple answer of this. That's up to you. What's your output? What's your usage? What do you want out of the image? If it's a once in a lifetime shot that you may want to blow it up to the size of a wall, well, then I would say that you may want to go and shoot with a raw image and then be able to really blow it up with the full 45 megapixels. But 11 megapixels is not anything to sneeze at. So I can't answer that. I don't think Brad can answer that either. I think this is going to be a you decision. And I would say it is going to be a choice by choice. I've been shooting a bunch of sports with the Z9, and I find that in certain circumstances, I will absolutely take that hit in lower resolution just to get the extra, as you said, wing positions for you, but for, let's say, tennis, being able to capture the tennis ball directly on the strings of the racket and literally seeing the deformation of the strings, that's an incredibly difficult shot to achieve if you're shooting even 30 frames a second. 120 frames a second, it makes you a tennis shooting god, and it's just so easy. Um,
Chris, did you happen to see the biathlon shooting event where the Nikon, some of the Z9s stopped the bullet?
I
Uh,
did. I did.
I am assuming those were shot at 120 frames a second.
Okay, so let's go back. So I'd asked, it started about Brett. So you had no luck with horse eyes. Your suggestions. If the camera doesn't focus on the particular subject, then you're going to have to go the old manual route of dynamic option or single point. Or to be honest, depending on how close you are to them, 3D. I was actually shooting 3D tracking with some horse racing this last weekend, and the camera actually picked up a lot of the horses quite well. I actually didn't want the horses; I wanted the people, so I was actually trying to keep it away from the horses. But it obviously depends on the distance to your subject. But if the camera doesn't detect the animal that you're shooting, then I'd go and recommend a little bit more manual autofocus options, just such as dynamic small. That'll give you the ability to you manually move the autofocus point where you want it and focus and track the eye as the animal's nice and close. So Steve, so you're asking, using single point AF on your Z7 with the Z100 to 400, you notice that the autofocus point jumps and you miss focus when using the normal VR mode. Sport VR mode fixes it. Did you find this with the Z9? Now, I'm actually curious about this because you shouldn't be missing focus per se. What you're actually seeing, so this is something that I didn't hint at it earlier, but I had said when Brad was talking about the different VR options, and I said I highly recommend VR Sport. And this is actually one of the reasons why. So when you're using normal, and you'll see this if you shoot, let's say, a close-up subject, you're filling the frame with the subject. Every time you shoot, what's happening with the VR element in the lens, or if it's the Ibis system, is it's going to what's called recenter, because that VR has the ability to shift and move to compensate for your movement. And what it's doing every single time you press the shutter is it's going to recenter itself, because recentering gives it the most amount of play up, down, left, and right. So you're going to get the most effective VR possible, which is a good thing, but not if it means that you're going to actually lose out on the composition. So one of the reasons I said very specifically, if you fill the frame with something, whether it's a lion, an elephant, your cat, your dog at home, if you fill the frame and you're using, let's say, a 70 to 200, crank it out to 200 and take a shot, you'll find that the resulting photo is going to have a slightly different composition than what you had seen in the viewfinder. And it's because of this recentering. So I always recommend that I'd say 99% of the shooting I do, I almost always use Sport VR, because with Sport VR, it doesn't do the recentering. Now, what that enables you to do is get the exact composition that you want at the time of shooting, but it also means that as you're panning, it's not doing this weird kind of herky-jerky movement because it's trying to recorrect in between every shot. So it allows you to pan in a much, much smoother way and makes your job, the photographer, much easier. So, Steve, I'm actually surprised that you're missing focus. You would be missing composition, but I don't know that it's focus. Theoretically, you shouldn't be missing with the Z9 focus either, but you will still have this recentering effect with any body that you use. Z7, Z7 II, D850, Z9, everything on the planet is going to work like this in normal VR mode. So Sport will definitely help that recentering issue that you might be seeing.
Chris, I'd just jump in and just make one other comment, because some folks may be missing one critical piece of information here, in terms of, then the question becomes, why ever use VR normal? And the reason you do use VR normal is that if you look at the absolute amount of image stabilization that goes on, it is higher in VR normal. And so if you're in those scenarios where, either you're hand holding a big lens, or you just absolutely are pushing the envelope with respect to how much stabilization you need, that's the only time I switch to VR normal. Other than that, as you suggested, it's 99.9% of the time I'm sitting on VR Sport, and it's just those scenarios where you're really pushing the envelope and going, my God, I don't know if I can handhold this, that you go to VR normal.
Yeah, and usually I'll use VR normal when I'm with a wider focal length. So if I'm doing landscapes and I'm trying to drag the shutter a little bit, if I'm 24-70 and I'm really kind of in that in-between time of night trying to shoot a landscape, but most of the time with the moving subject matter of, let's say, wildlife, you're going to be in shutter speeds that it won't really matter that much. It's not going to be the hand holding effect. It's going to be the panning effect that you're going to want a smoother action of. So the sport is going to do a good enough job. So long story. I'm going to jump over to Luke. Luke had a couple questions, and I'm going to answer both questions very quickly and say, Luke, I don't know. So one was, Brad, is your firmware suggestion list going to be implemented by Nikon? Brad has some really good options on there. I hope that some of those make it into the list, but unfortunately, Brad doesn't have any say in it. I don't even have much say in the matter. It really comes down to Japan, what they feel is important, what they have time to do, because there's a lot of different stuff going on behind the scenes. So I don't know on the first question. And your second question is also an I don't know, because you're asking, when can you expect the 200 to 600 and the new 400 lens, which I don't think the new 400 lens has been said to be a PF. So I don't know that that's, I won't say that as a confirmed thing. But again, I don't know. When we get them, that's when we get them. Now, Brad, I'm gonna have a question for you. So Moshi, I know Moshi. So he is asking wildlife, nature, landscape, or sports, Z9 or D6. My answer is a little biased. I'm just going to say the Z9. The D6 is very, very good in a smaller band of uses. When you talk about wildlife, when you talk about sports, yes, the D6 is amazing, but due to its lower megapixel count and the fact that it may not have the exact dynamic range that a Z9 does, I would say that for landscape work in particular, and we can kind of broaden that out, but we'll keep it at landscape work, it's not going to be as good. So I would say as a general all-around do everything camera, the Z9 is going to be my easy choice there.
Well, I'd second that, absolutely. I'm not sure I should mention this, but I'm now I'm no longer a D6 shooter, only because, after getting my Z9 and spending time with it, it became apparent to me that the niche uses for my D6, which really came down to extreme low lighting. And then after doing ISO testing, I found that last sort of bastion of, that's why I need that camera, mostly disappeared. And then, as you stated, Chris, the versatility of the higher resolution sensor, and I haven't seen tests yet, but based on what I've seen through the viewfinder and through actually processing images, I'm sure we have a higher dynamic range at the low ISOs on the Z9, so a better landscape in that regard. And in my mind, the camera that held for a long time the best all-rounder category for all the things he was talking about had been the D750. That was a fantastic all-rounder. Some people would argue it was replaced by the D850, but now in my mind, for the mix of things I do, there's no question the Z9 is the single best camera. And that's those wide, and I don't do that much landscape shooting, but at the same time I shoot a lot of animal scapes, which are functionally the same in terms of the requirements of the camera. So,
well, as usual, we agree. Okay, so there's a couple questions here that are kind of related. So I'm going to ask a couple of them all at once, and we'll I'm assuming that we'll kind of meander our way through and answer them both. So Farwatch asked, he'd love to hear about the 100 to 400 with the teleconverters, both the 1.4 and the 2. And then I'm also going to throw in Andrew's question of the fact that you have the Z9, do the F-mount lenses lose image quality when being used on the Z9? So I'm going to kind of tie those two in together. And I will say very, very simply, Andrew's question of, when you use F-mount glass on a Z9, do you lose image quality? The answer is no. If anything, you gain image quality. Regarding, let's say, the accuracy of the focus, especially, and this is kind of tying it into Farwatch's question, when used with teleconverters. Now, this works not only F-mount, but also Z-mount. But Brad, I know you have an absolute newfound love for teleconverters when you started shooting with the Z6 and the Z7, and now it's obviously taken off even more with the Z9, the fact that you can go and use a 500 mil. I'm assuming right now that you have a teleconverter on the 500 mil, or is it by itself right now?
This moment, no. it's just gotta. But yes, you're right. It's a fantastic 700 meter f8 lens, and you throw on a 100p, you throw a 1.4 teleconverter. Yeah, I'll second what you're saying there, Chris, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on the 100 to 400 performance with teleconverters. And I think the best kept secret, I say it's a secret, but everyone's been yelling out who's tried it, is the style performance of teleconverters on Z bodies in general. So when you put them on an F-mount lens with a teleconverter that may or may not have worked well on a DSLR and put it on a Z-mount body, and I've tried Z6s, Z7, Z7 II, Z6, and Z9, you just have this big incremental bump in quality. And I think Chris is right that it's got to do with the accuracy of the focus. And we didn't, so some teleconverter combinations that we may not have wanted to use in the past, we can now use. Now, specifically with the 100 to 400, that lens, I've done a lot of testing with teleconverters with it, and I've compared against some other very good lenses. And you'll find that it performs extremely well with both the 1.4, the Z-mount 1.4 teleconverter, as well as the 2, but you won't be quite matching what you would get out of that same focal length if you were not using a teleconverter. Now, what do I mean by that? So if you throw, as an example, on a 100 to 400, you put a 1.4x teleconverter, you've got up to 560 millimeters. Now, if you back that off to 500 and shoot it head to head with a 500 PF, the 500 PF will be slightly sharper. There's no two ways about it. But it's not dramatic. It's a little sharper. And so there's many situations where you would be absolutely pleased with your results. You go to a 2X, and again, you all of a sudden start shooting up to potentially 800 millimeters. You're not going to match an 800 millimeter f5.6 lens, or assuming when we see the new 800 6.3 PF. But that being said, you're getting very acceptable results. So it's a good solution. You'll find still probably you'll get better results on shooting them on a prime. So if, when we have the 400 f2.8s actually in hands, I personally think you will get better results with a 2x teleconverter at 400 millimeters with that lens than we would with the 100 400 zoom. But that being said, you're still getting very good results with the 100 to 400 with teleconverters.
Okay, so I think we'll jump on. I totally agree with all that. The image quality seen with teleconverters is spectacular with the Z bodies, and we won't get into the differences between phase and contrast detect AF, but basically the autofocus, the hybrid AF that the mirrorless cameras use, seem to do an amazing job. And there was somebody down below, John, who asked, should we be using AF fine tune on our F-mount lenses? And my answer to that is a very simple no. It is there. If you do choose, for whatever reason, you want to change the focal plane of where the camera is focusing, that's the only thing I can really think of. I have never seen anybody who actually requires, when you sit down and do a standardized test, where they can show you that it's repeatable, that one of their F-mount or their Z-mount lenses are front or back focusing. It's usually, and I say this not in a mean way at all, but there's usually a user error. And there's a million and one places that this can come from. But in my examples that I've seen so far, mirrorless cameras do not need fine tuning. That was a vestige of the DSLR age, and you don't need that with mirrorless. So that is always a good thing, that we don't have to do one more extra step to make sure that our systems are always working. So let's now jump in, and Krishna, you had a couple questions here. And one of them I know is going to send Brad on a very long tangent. So I feel I should go get a coffee while he does it. But the first question, is there a way to change the behavior of the function button you would prefer to have, not to hold it, but a press and then kind of go back to it? So that's actually one of the things that Brad has on his very long list of what he wants from future firmware updates. That is something, for anybody who's out there watching, that's something that was found on the D6. It was something that I've actually already mentioned to Japan as like ooh, that would be nice to have. So hopefully, but we can't guarantee until anything happens. But the thing that's going to set Brad off, and I know he's getting excited already as he's reading it, is what is recall shooting option? So they're coming from a Z6 II and a D850, and they want to be able to understand what it is and where you can use it for bird photography. So Brad, I know that this is one of your loves of not only this camera, but also the D6 and the D5 as well. Well, the D6 expanded on its capability. So yeah, I'll kind of let you go with it, because I know how much you love it.
Okay, and Jacob, let's again go over to the camera itself here. Give me the desktop, basically. So what recall shooting functions is, it's a way of programming a button to change multiple settings in your camera all at once. So you can just push a button, and many of the buttons on the cameras can be assigned to this function. And in doing so, you can change just a plethora of controls at once and move from one shooting scenario to a very different one, and the camera with the push of a button is ready to go. So again, we go into the controls, which is in the custom settings menu, and we go down to custom controls shooting, which is F2. And it's a little hidden, and this is where the function is found, but you've got to find a button that supports it. So as an example, the AF on button is one button that supports it. So we could go into this button and then scroll through, and we'll find recall shooting functions in this list. And there it is. And now that we're there, if we scroll to the right or toggle to the right, we're into all the things that can be set up in recall shooting functions. And this is very similar to the way it was set up on the D6, but of course in the D6 we didn't have the ability to do the same kind of subject recognition or subject detection. Now note that any one of these can be toggled off, so it ignores it. So if your camera was already set up in aperture priority mode, if you didn't have this first option toggled, it would stay in aperture priority mode. And if you press it, it means it'll be switch over to whatever mode you want, and I could go in and change it to any mode I want. Same with shutter speed. Now if I'm shooting in manual, I get the ability to change both shutter speed and aperture. And you could dial in any exposure compensation you wanted. You could go into your ISO sensitivity settings, and you don't have full control over the auto ISO, but what it will do is inherit the auto ISO settings in the shooting bank that you're in before you push the button for recall shooting functions. Same with metering, you can override the metering you're using, all these different things. And so you can end up going through and specifying a lot of different options. Now this last one I'm going to set on for just a second, because between shooting banks you actually can't change the release mode. You can't store it in different shooting banks. However, it can be stored in recall shooting functions. And so you could go in and say, okay, I want a bird in flight setting. Now what this setting's for, right, by the way, I'll just mention that that'll give some context here. I've got this one set up, this set of recall shooting functions set up for unexpected action, but in not the brightest light. So I've got it set to manual exposure mode. I haven't set the shutter speed to something like 1/3200th or faster, simply because I don't want to drive the ISO super high, and in many situations this is going to be high enough. And so this setting is set up for shooting action in relatively, or sort of mid-light, or mid-tone sort of light. And I've got my subject detection option. Now in this case, I've opted to go to animals as opposed to auto. I'm finding a little better performance with animals if I'm in the animal mode as opposed to the auto mode. That's anecdotal. I don't have firm test information on that, but it seems to be working a little bit better on the grabbing the eye just a little bit better. Now, something I want to point out, because I've had this question a million times already, is there's some people who are asking for, okay, is there a way to turn subject detection on and off with the push of a single button? And the answer to this is yes. You won't find a button anywhere on the camera that you'll go into it and it'll say, instantly, toggles subject detection on or off. But if you stop and think about how recall shooting functions work, if I toggle off every single option all the way down and have them turned off, and then I go to subject detection and the camera, and say the camera had been set up by default, you were already shooting with subject detection off. If I change this to subject detection off, and I turn everything else off, when I push the button that this is assigned to, it will instantly turn subject detection off and do nothing else to the camera. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you can do with recall shooting functions. So there's many times you'll run into a scenario saying, geez, I can't program the button to do that. And you think, maybe I can within recall shooting functions. So it's a more powerful way to control a single button. Now, as Chris mentioned before, there was one thing that was executed a little bit better, in my opinion, on the D6, is that you could actually, with recall shooting functions, there was two versions of it. There was recall shooting functions and recall shooting functions hold. And what recall shooting functions hold meant was that you just had to push the button once and it would go to recall shooting functions and stay there until you pushed it again. It basically turned it into a toggle, and that was fantastic. You didn't have to tie up your thumb or whatever other finger you were using or digit you were using to actually hold the button. You just had to hit it once and it would stay in the new mode. So I'm hoping that we'll see that firmware update in the Z9, but of course I can't say we will, but it did come as a firmware update in the D6, so I think there's probably a good reason to think that somewhere down the road we'll see it. But don't forget, you can have, because this is stored in the custom shooting menu and you have 4 different banks of them, you can set up 4 different recall shooting functions. So it actually can work extremely effectively in the field. So I think I could go on all night about this, but I think I'll stop there and let Chris go back to our questions. So I hope we touched on that one well enough.
I think that was a really, really good explanation of it. And if Krishna does want more, then they can always go onto your blog, which I won't go and throw it in the chat right now just because going through too many of the questions, but I definitely want to go and throw your blog in here for people to go and watch, because you have a lot of information in there that definitely, if they want to really go, kind of pick through the minutia of the cameras, it is a fantastic resource. Now, Steve is asking, do you notice the noise reduction? So if you're shooting at higher ISOs, I'm assuming, in body affecting any quality while shooting wildlife? So do you turn the in-body NR off and handle it in post-processing? Any recommendations? I'll just say pretty quickly that if you're shooting JPEG, obviously it's going to have an impact. If you're shooting RAW, then it won't have an impact at all one way or the other, unless you're assuming that you're using a software either like our Nikon NX Studio, which will be able to take those exact settings and essentially copy them, or if you are using something like Lightroom, which will see if you have, let's say, in-camera noise reduction turned to be very high in camera, Well, if you have the Lightroom turned on, so when you import the images, it will take that very high NR and actually apply it to your image. So while that can be a good thing in terms of it porting over settings and different stuff you have set up in the camera, there are certain things you do want to be careful of, such as noise reduction. You don't want too high of noise reduction to be turned on and to be blurring out all that detail if you're not aware of it. So just to be aware that to have it set to an option that you're comfortable with if you are having your settings ported over. But in, let's say, Brad's case, where he's shooting and editing in Capture One, it doesn't matter whether he has it turned on off or on extra high. He's going to go into Capture One and do it to his settings of the way he wants it, because it's going to have no impact whatsoever. Okay, so let's jump on to the next one. So Sunchi, I haven't seen you in so long. Hopefully you're shooting lots of time lapses. You're asking, is the Z9 ISO invariant? And I'll give the easy answer of Nikon. We don't ever really say whether our sensors are invariant. We always kind of leave that to people testing afterwards. From what I have seen in external testing, it does seem to be, if not exactly ISO invariant, very, very close. Basically, to anybody who's watching afterwards, that basically means that whether you change the ISO in camera from, let's say, 800 to 6400, or whether you go and shoot with, let's say, a darkened image, so you get to shoot with a faster shutter speed, and then afterwards in post, bump it up those, what was that, 3 stops I did? 8, 16, 32, 4. So 4 stops. If you're going to bump it up plus 4 in your post-processing software, if a sensor is ISO invariant, the noise essentially is going to be the same. And from what I've seen, externally, people testing it, it does seem to be invariant, but that's not something that that Nikon confirms or denies with our sensor design. So Mike, you're asking, is there any chance of disabling the sub-control dial or disabling the focus point is locked message? So what's being asked here is, so what you're able to do is you're able to use the little 8-way controller on the back here, and you can lock this so that when you go and move it up, down, left, right, northeast, southwest, you're not going to move the autofocus point. But when you do that, if you have it locked, a message is going to pop up. And Mike, unfortunately, as of right now, no, there is no way of getting around that. If we did get rid of that message, then I could see it leading to a lot of problems. Obviously, like you, who, let's say, has your camera set that way, you know it, and you would know I have to turn it off when I want to go and use that joystick. But I could see that becoming problematic if you move it and it doesn't tell you how to get out of it. So there's a lot of kind of small little things I could see with that. So as of right now, there's no way to get around that, unfortunately. So now we're going to jump down a couple. So Krishna, we're going to actually jump back to one of your other questions here. Brad, have you noticed that when you shoot with multiple birds in a scene, and you're using, obviously, the subject detection, so with IAF, do you have an issue where the little box will jump from one eye to the other and not track a single bird? I know I have my answer for this. Brad, what's yours?
Well, with the Z9, to be honest, I haven't shot flocks. I haven't been in a flock situation, so I can't say. I've done it with the Z6 too, but it's going to behave very differently. So I don't think my answer here will be representative. Okay. So Chris, you go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump to mine then. And I'll basically say it depends on the autofocus mode that you're shooting with. If you're shooting with, let's say, 3D, which is what I would usually recommend for a scene like that, what happens with 3D tracking is you're able to, let's say, put your original autofocus point, and instead of moving the camera, let's say we move the autofocus point up to my eye. Then you press and hold the autofocus, either the back button or the shutter. And at that point, you're telling the camera, focus on this eye. So if another person comes here and another person comes here and another person comes here, the camera isn't going to jump, even though it sees the other eyes. And it will tell you, pop, and it'll show you the little boxes around the eyes. It won't actually jump from one to the other because you've told it using the 3D algorithm, focus on this eye. So I would say, Krishna, that you generally won't run into that issue. I'm just trying to think of most of the time when I've been shooting with multiple birds, it has been with 3D tracking, and I haven't run into anything else. I haven't really kind of played around too much and tried the wide area or auto, but to be honest, you're going to get something. Yeah, to be honest, in a situation like that, I would say just use 3D and you won't even run into any problems. So Rick is asking, in a nature scene with only animals, is there any disadvantage to setting the subject detection type to auto instead of animals? And Brad, you and I had talked about this, was it last week or the week before? The days are all blending together.
Yeah.
I personally, and I'm stating that very clearly, I personally have not seen any difference whether I shoot auto or whether I shoot with the individualized vehicle, animal, or human detection modes. But I have seen quite a bit of people talking online where they have seen in some cases, in let's say very tricky situations, when they go switch to animal, they will find that certain birds are picked up a little bit better when you are specific with the subject to type that you've told the camera to look at. So my personal experience is no, but I have seen some people say specifically with birds under difficult situations, they have seen it act a little bit better. So I can't give an exact answer on that. Brad, have you seen anything?
Well, two comments on that. One, I've got a very credible report from a photographer I know in California who was working in low light with a perched bird of prey. And as the light faded very, very low, he had been starting with shooting on auto subject detect. And he found after a while it was still holding the hawk, it would stray from the eye. And he toggled back and forth multiple times between animal and auto. And he did find under auto that under animal in that scenario, that in very low light, it held better on the eye. So that's I wasn't the one doing this, but I know the photographer well, and he's very particular about these kinds of things. So I think there's a highly good reason to suspect in low light, you might have better success with animal in terms of recognizing eyes in that. And in my own shooting, I think what can go on, or what I've noticed, is a little bit stickier on the eye when I'm on animal, but this is anecdotal. I've still got to suss that out further. So I won't say definitively that my own testing has shown that yet. The one thing that and this won't come up much with wildlife, it's more of if someone's shooting pets and that, and Chris, jump in if I'm wrong here, but I've noticed that there seems to be, if you've got a human and an animal in close proximity, if you're in auto mode, it seems to take priority to the person, but I could be wrong on that. But I did some tests with the dog in front, beside, behind, and it seemed to always first go to the human eye. And so in that scenario, if that's true, and in that scenario, and you wanted the dog's eye in focus, I think the solution there would be to go to animal. But again, this is anecdotal. I didn't, this was not a rigid, systematic test. So, but I did get the feeling in those, when there's mixed subjects in the frame close together, that the priority was human. But I don't know if you have any experience on that.
I do. I was using actually an example that, not to say that what you saw was wrong, but I was actually using an example back when we first came out with the camera, where I had a woman kneeling down next to a dog, and then the dog ran towards the camera, and my camera actually jumped right to the dog with no problem. We did it a couple times, so it might be situational based. I'm not 100% sure. Right. And obviously very similar to how I answered the flock of birds type of question. It depends on the autofocus mode that you're using. With 3D, yeah. Again, that's the mode I'm using most of the time. You're able to, as the photographer, dictate whether it goes to the human or the animal. So it changes, but I think there's no real definitive answer there. And one other thing that we'll kind of jump to, and I'm not going to ask a single question here, because there's a couple of them that I've seen pop up with high contrast birds in flight, people having a few issues with it. One person, which Pete, you're saying that you're shooting a snowy owl in white, super contrast white conditions, and it kept losing focus. So that is probably one of the most difficult situations for anything to track, whether it's using subject detection or not. And I would say that at that point, the only thing I could really recommend is, and Jacob, I'm going to jump to my screen here, is when I go and show the menus here, because what you're seeing in the viewfinder is how the camera is actually trying to track. So if you, the photographer, can barely see the difference in contrast, well, then the camera is also going to have a very difficult time finding the contrast. So if you go into the custom setting menu under D shooting, and you actually go to, I have right here, D8 view mode for photo, show effects, that's obviously going to show the effect of what you are going to capture. So it's going to have a direct impact as to what you see versus what the final image is going to be. They're going to be the same. What I would maybe recommend trying, and this isn't, I'm not saying that this is going to be a perfect fix, but if you go to adjust for ease of viewing, what that's most likely going to do is it's most likely going to dial the exposure down of the entire scene because it's so bright and high contrast. And what that most likely will do, I'm hoping, is that it will actually provide a little bit more contrast, a little bit more subject definition of the, let's say in this case, the snowy owl. And what that might do is give the camera a little bit better of a chance to actually recognize it and track it and detect it all the way through its flight path. So that would be my recommendation. Now, obviously, that comes with its own perils, where if you are in changing light conditions and you turn off the show effects, then that means that you are not going to be getting exact feedback as to what your final image is going to look like. So if you are, let's say, shooting full manual with no auto ISO turned on, and you turn that off, well, what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to see what your images look like. You're going to be in DSLR mode, which isn't a bad thing, but just something to keep in the back of your head. So I don't have an exact answer for you. I'm not sure, Brad, if you do, but I would recommend that as an option to try.
Yeah, there's use cases that exceed, like you say, I've had a few reports as an example of people shooting bison with, almost black eyes and very dark fur, and a bit of a struggle where the autofocus may have found the head, which is an odd shaped head to begin with, but, might have struggled for the eye. But, that's a scenario where I'd go, geez, I wonder if I can even see the eye. And so it's a tough call there. And that's, to a certain degree, that's why, having something like 3D tracking, where it's sort of the best of the both worlds of single point with subject tracking, you can just toggle the point to where you want. So, you more or less are overriding in that case anyways, and controlling where the focus point's going, because this has always been the issue with, the big issue that people are facing is how comfortable are they handing over autofocus control to the camera versus doing it themselves. And it's certainly an evolutionary process with this camera, because you're going to have a lot of people, including me, who may have been naysayers coming in saying, gosh, I'm a single point shooter and I want to be in control. And it takes a little while for you to, after you're seeing enough results, to finally relinquish that control. It's interesting, because I do run into scenarios still, not commonly, but where I do the override. And the other thing that I'm surprised we haven't been asked this, actually, and I'll just mention it now, I am finding that for my style of shooting, we all have a default AF mode, and mine is 3D tracking with subject detection on. For me, that's my default, and I have buttons I can, to push to move away from that if I choose, but my default, and I'm not moving off that much, is 3D tracking.
Yep, me too. That's my almost go-to at all the time. And there's actually a very quick question at the very bottom. Tibor is asking, tying that into the 3D, have you experimented with 3D tracking without subject detection turned on? And if so, what were the results? So I'll probably answer that one quickly. Basically, I almost never use it with subject detection turned off because that's one of the main benefits of 3D is it uses the subject detection. But if for whatever reason you don't want it on, 3D tracking without subject detection essentially works like 3D tracking in our DSLRs, where you're mainly going to be, or the camera is mainly going to be basing its tracking performance based on color. It's obviously still going to be looking at distance information. There's a whole lot of other things that will go into it, but the main determiner for tracking is color-based. So if you have, let's say, a yellow bird right behind a yellow wall of flowers, well, it may not work quite as well. You'll probably get much better results using subject detection because it will actually notice the outline of the bird, grab onto the eye, and you'll usually do a much better job.
And Chris, just the only thing I'd mention there is that it's still very, very sticky, with the subject detection off. I have done some testing with it and it still sticks like glue. And one comment to Tibor is, I will respond to your email that came a couple days ago. I've been snowed. So sorry about that, Tibor. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go through another question here. There was one. It was one that I was going to have a very simple answer for. Brett, so $1 million question. Can they give us 120 frame per second RAWs? And my answer is probably not. I don't know for sure. We may be able to heavily push out through future firmwares, but that seems like a bit much to me. We'll have to see what does come, but I wouldn't hold my breath on 120 frame per second RAW. Yeah, so Steve is good with that. Stephen H is saying that he's listing his D6 tomorrow. A few people saying that there's Michelle, totally agreeing with us about the teleconverters. Hey, Michelle, how's it going? And then Vern actually has a really, really good comment about, so we talked about teleconverters, specifically the Z70-200. When you put a teleconverter on there, you actually have a really good, it's not true one-to-one macro, but you actually get quite a bit closer than I think a lot of people realize you're able to with what they consider a telephoto lens. So that's a really, really good option if you do have a teleconverter and the Z70-200. Because of its close focusing distance, it's relatively large magnification ratio. You can do a pretty good macro alternative with that lens. And I think Russ answered Fred, but I will double Russ's answer of that is not a stupid question at all. You will have to go with F-mount glass to the F-mount TC to the FTZ adapter to the Z body. That's the order that it goes in. I hope I didn't say that too quickly. There's a couple there. Questions, boom, boom, boom. Okay, perfect. One more here. Yeah, so Steve is going on. Okay, perfect. Can you comment on the noise with very high ISO, Z9 versus Z7 versus Z7 II versus Z6? I will say very quickly on that one, the Z7, Z7 II, identical. For all intents and purposes, I can see no difference at all between those cameras, so I'll just talk to them as one unit. The Z7 versus Z6, that's a totally different ballgame. Now we're talking about what is your output? What are you scaling the images down to? Are you pixel peeping at full 100% resolution on both images? So there's a lot to go into there. But I think, Brad, you'll agree with me that if I say the Z9 and the Z7 or the Z7 II is going to be very close, if not identical. I have seen a few instances because what we're actually doing in the background in some cases is a lot of the times where you see noise is not in detail. You'll see it in that really blurry background. So we're actually doing some of the more higher end noise reduction that you are seeing with some other, let's say, third-party softwares, where it will try and not touch the, let's say, detail of your eyelashes, but it may try and get rid of some of the noise in that very blurry background. So in some cases, I have seen the Z9 be a bit better than the Z7 II. Not anything, I'm not talking like a stop or two. I'm talking probably a third of a stop, if that. So very, very close. But again, the Z9 versus Z6 II, that depends on a whole fact. I would say you can get as good as a Z6 II, depending on what your output is and depending on what your post-processing for noise reduction is. You can get it as good, but if you're going to pixel peep right off the bat, right off the 100% sensor, the Z6 will look better, but you can get the Z9 to be as good, if not a little bit better. Brad, you agree?
The only thing I'd add there, Chris, is when I downsampled, did the Z6 II versus the Z9 comparison, you're absolutely right that if you look at on screen at 100% full resolution images, the Z6 images will appear cleaner. There's no two ways about it. But the simple process of downsampling them using whatever raw converter you're using brought it back to virtually no difference between it. So you were down, and I'm not talking a third of a stop, I'm talking no difference. We're talking they were virtually identical. And so it's the whole issue of, like you say, what are you going to do with the image, and do you need an image bigger than the Z6 II at that clean? Well, then you may not be happy, but if Z6 II size, which is 24 megapixels, you're fine with the Z9 in terms of matching it after downsampling. Absolutely.
Okay, so
and like I say, it's close to the. Sorry about that. It's close to the. In that regard, it's very close to the D3 or D3, the D6. So,
I'd hope it would be a little bit better than the D3. Okay, so we're getting a little bit long in the tooth here. We're at 10:35 Eastern Standard Time, so we're just pushing past an hour and a half. So we only have a couple questions left. So what I'll kind of do is I'll ask them here. So Angelica asked, photo flicker reduction, keep it on if shooting performances in a theater? Yes. Easy. Yes. Keep it on and you will be very happy for it. And then there's two questions. I'm actually going to throw them both to Brad because they both are asking Brad. That would be a little bit egotistical of me to do otherwise. But Stephen H. Is going to ask the first question that's going to get Brad down a long rabbit hole. And then Blair is going to ask another one that's going to get him down a rabbit hole. So Stephen H. is asking, Brad, do you use back button focusing?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the answer is no, and I don't, and I haven't for years. And it's interesting, I don't have to go too far down a rabbit hole here. This is a very simple explanation, especially on the Z9. I'm getting a lot of people emailing me at all levels of photography. There's, pro sports photographers, and just with the layout of the Z9 and what you can do in terms of configuring the buttons, I'm seeing a trend towards people who had historically been or had switched to back button focus, finding that there's an advantage in the Z9 to use shutter release focus, or sometimes a combination thereof, where you initiate focus with the shutter and then push another button to change focus modes if you'd like to a different one. And what really happens with the Z9 is we have at least two new buttons relative to the DSLRs right by our thumb. One is the display button, one is the info button. But then if you look further down, you've got the menu button, you've got all these other buttons, and if you're doing your focusing with that thumb on the back button, with this camera you end up with a very busy thumb, and it can be a bit of an issue. So no, I'm using 3D tracking based off the shutter release, and then if I do want to switch, I simply push a different button. So I'll switch to wide area by pushing AF on, or I'll switch to wide area large, or I'll switch to wide area small, pushing down on the sub selector, which is the toggle. You normally toggle it around. So the answer there is very clearly I'm using shutter release focus as my default on 3D. So the second question.
Well, I'll just jump in. Brad, I'll let you read Blair Takahashi's question, and I'll just kind of give my own little take on back button focusing. I'm a back button focuser, but in no way, shape, or form do I think that everybody should. And like Brad said, with the functionality of the Z9, there's so many different ways you can set the camera up that you don't have to shoot that way anymore, because back button focusing for for a lot of people back when they switched to it with, let's say, DSLRs or even the other mirrorless cameras, it was done as a way to speed things up because the camera wasn't good enough. The human had to take a little bit more of the control. But now we're seeing, as Brad said before, there's a lot of photographers out there who are willing. And Michelle Valberg, one of our Nikon Canada ambassadors, I know she has absolutely given a ton more control to the Z9. Christian Bogner, another one of our ambassadors, has given a ton more control than I've ever seen. And Brad, you were one of the first ones that when I was talking to you, and you went, "Oh my God, Chris! Like I'm letting the Z9 do so much," and it's almost a bit of a fear thing at first because pro photographers, you all have been doing this for so long that you're used to doing it. So back button focusing was a way to kind of hold on to a little bit more control, get a little bit better at doing things. But the Z9 means that you maybe don't have to. I still do it because it's just wired into my brain, but there's no right or wrong for anything we've said today. You may hopefully agree with what we've said, but there's a lot of opinion that we've given all of tonight, and I think back button focusing is just another one of those major divisions within the photographic ranks. And there's no right or wrong answer. It just kind of depends on how you feel. But I will throw it over to you now that you've had time to read Blair's question. Is there a story that you want to share where the Z9 really kind of blew your mind, or it was a real kind of game changer that made you just go, "Oh goodness, this is something that I'm gonna have to sell all my DSLRs for"?
Well, I'll just finish off with one quick comment on the back button versus shutter release focus. Is that used to be a polarizing issue, and I think the minute we started adding to the functionality to the buttons where they could be not only switching AF area mode but also AF on, all of a sudden that became, I think, more of a moot point, because you can be using multiple buttons now to do the AF on portion, and it's not just either AF on, which is traditionally thought of as the back button, versus the shutter release. You know, if I grab my function 3 button, that takes me over to single point and it focuses. So I'm focusing now with my, you know, my ring finger basically. I'm focusing with so this dichotomy of do you use your thumb versus index finger is becoming, or what button do you use, is becoming a bit of a moot argument at this point. It's use what works best for you, for sure. Now, I was stalling also to think of an answer to Blair's question. So well, one of the first things, the question is can you share a story where the performance of the Z9 blew your mind, or game-changing moment for you? One of them was something that Chris took a series of images that was the first aha moment. I'm pretty sure they were your images, Chris, of a certain hawk that blew me away in terms of the subject tracking, and the frame rate, which was, I believe it was 120 frames a second you were shooting that at. And it was a hawk that just took off from a perch and flew directly at Chris, and I was like, oh my God. But I have to say, the first day I started shooting with the Z9, I was literally blown away with the speed of the subject tracking. And I'm not saying it's perfect, because it's not perfect on any camera. But things that I started noticing was people that I thought of as a spec. Here's the sequence Chris we're talking about. People are a speck in my viewfinder, and it's finding their eye, and that's blowing me away as well. And same thing with some of the wildlife I've been working with, distant elk, distant deer, and I may not be shooting those all the time. I often like to get up close and personal with the subjects, but that being said, it's really been the autofocus modes on it that have blown me away. But it's also just that combined with so many other things. I love the fact that we've got a fully electronic shutter now that's really effective. So I can forget about things like the mirror slapping and giving us on long exposure landscapes. And I could go down the list, but there's just a whole list of things that, to me, collectively, I looked at those going, my God, God, I have to have this camera. And it's a challenge. It's so different in terms of its capabilities that you end up setting it up differently than something like a D6 because you want to take advantage of all these features. And so it does take a while to really appreciate everything it can do. But boy, once you spend the time with it, it's just an amazing piece of technology. And in a way, the autofocus system, once you're comfortable with it, gets out of the way. So you don't even have to think about, if you're using 3D tracking effectively, it locks on, and then you can worry about composition. All of a sudden you've got, whatever you're testing, a running dog, a bird in flight, you can focus on composition and forget about focus at that point, which is fantastic. So
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that obviously, like, shooting wildlife is amazing, shooting sports is great. You really see the action you're able to, maybe you had to really struggle to capture before. But one of the simple things that really kind of blew my mind was I was taking pictures of my son, of my little 2-year-old, and I was using a 50mm lens at 1.2, so I was fully wide open, and he loves seeing the photo on the back of the camera. So basically he runs at me full speed, not because he's trying to be cute, not because he's trying to get me. He wants to go and see the camera. So I kind of try and use that to my advantage, where I try and get a running shot of him, but that means that I have to be running the opposite direction or else he's going to catch me pretty quick. So I'm shooting 50mm, 1.2, completely wide open. And literally I popped the screen so that it's vertical, and I held it down at basically knee level because he's a little guy and I'm a tall guy. And basically I just had it set to 3D autofocus, had made sure that the autofocus point was around the top of the frame where it was going to capture his eye, mashed down on the autofocus button and ran. And in my mind, when I was doing this, there was no way that I was going to get keepers. I was just like, I've tried this before with any number of cameras that I've done, ours and other brands, and it never works the way that you hope. The Z9 was almost every single thing was in focus. And this is a little 2-year-old, not just like toddling back and forth. This is him burning towards me in really erratic patterns. And that, for me, as amazing as all the other stuff was, that was a first where I looked at the images on the computer and went, oh my God, like the eye is tack sharp. So there's so much, as Brad was saying, there's so much that you can do. And it really allows you to just focus on other things. It kind of takes the worry out of the equation, and it lets you worry about the things like composition, is your exposure right, so many of the other things that you had to do in the background anyways, but it lets you just take so much more of a forethought with that I find it just makes shooting that much more fun and that much easier.
Yeah, it's certainly more fun. That's one thing I'm finding, is that the fun factor is back in a major way,
Yep.
And that's huge, right? That's huge.
Yep, totally agree. All right, so we're at basically an hour 45 right now. If there's any last little questions, yeah, I know. My 6 hours. I think we could hit that if we wanted to. Is there anything? Actually, you know what? While I'm talking, yeah, I'll see if I can do it. Yeah, I can. So while we're just kind of finishing up here, what I'm going to do is, I'm sure everybody pretty much knows it already, but I am going to throw Brad's blog here. So there's a link here that you guys can go and follow, brings you to his blog. A lot of amazing information that you can go and pick up, not only about the Z9, but about the NIKKOR Z lenses, about if you do want to read about his D6 escapades before he switched over. There's a ton of information about D6s on there. There's also a lot of stuff on his photo tours. I don't want to be a commercial for Brad, but I personally would love to go on one of the photo tours that he has. I don't think you have many spots left for this year. I think the COVID backup has people just chomping at the bit to jump on the tours. But I know you have some stuff on your site there as well as to what ones you have coming up in 2022. So there's a ton of information there. And also, if you just want to contact Brad, I know that the waiting list to get an email from Brad is, I think, about 6.5 months at this point. If I'm not,
I'm good, Chris. I'm good.
But yeah, definitely everybody check that out. There's a lot of information. I hope that tonight was enjoyable. I truly do. We had quite a few people sticking on. We're still over 100 people, well over an hour and 45 minutes in, which is spectacular. So I want to say thank you guys for a Wednesday night. Going and staying up with us, especially Kirsty, who's over in the UK, and it's almost 4 a.m. So thank you very much for sticking around with us. Yeah, we really appreciate it. We hope that this has been beneficial to you. If you are curious, Brad has had multiple appearances on Nikon TV over the last little while. He's had a ton of experience with the Z9. So if you go check out either our YouTube page that you're watching on now or our Facebook, there's our Nikon TV episodes where I blather on for a little bit before I actually get to the thing you guys want, which is the guest. And Brad's gone and had some great info there as well. So there's a lot of places for you to go and get more information from us that has already been out there, content that's already out there. You can go and contact. Oh, so yeah, one last thing. Stephen Polivoy saying, so 3D tracking, you're basically a pro. As much as I don't want to say it, it's getting there. The camera is so good now that it is taking a lot of the guesswork and a lot of the tough time that you had to go through. Yeah, it's basically built right into the camera. So it is getting you that little step. But Stephen, I will say you will have to learn the Z9 to really get the most out of the camera, to really kind of take that extra step over. But basically everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. It was a lot of fun. I know I really enjoy these. I'm hoping that we're able to do more in-person stuff later on in the year, assuming things get better. You'll hopefully be seeing me at trade shows. You'll hopefully be seeing me at camera shops around your local area. And yeah, if there's anything else you guys want to know, well, you know, where am I pointing? You know Brad's email.
And I do respond.
You absolutely do. Absolutely do. Brad, is there anything you wanted to end off with before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. I do have a few spots on my photo tours, Chris, but for this year. But again, let's not turn this into a commercial. I'm sure they'll fill without problem. So no, I just want to thank everyone for coming in. I'm really been blown away by how many people have stuck it out, and I'm just looking at the comments still flowing in. And you're welcome, and thanks for showing up. So it was enjoyable, and it's always fun to share the information about the camera. So
awesome. So with that, thank you guys very much, and good night. We'll see you on the next live stream that we do here on the Nikon channel.
Cheers now.